Welcome, everybody, to our very first Missouri Native Stewardships podcast. Can you believe it? We're actually doing this. Big credit to our guru of all social media, Miss Missy Castro, who is the wizard behind all of this. And somehow she's got her hooks into both Charlie and I to do this morning. So thank you for joining us. We're going to kind of have a really informal conversation about small steps that we can make in our own backyards and how those begin to add up over time and multiply the impact. If you're a follower of native plants and follower of regenerative agriculture or sustainability, or God forbid the wild ones that are all spread all across this country, the whole idea behind adding and integrating natives more and more into our landscapes because of all the natural benefits are really coming to the fore, and you see it more and more in the news, more and more every day, from animal health to bee health and backyard pollinators. And so Charlie is here today because Charlie is a big thinker about this small town of ours called St. Louis, and Charlie's seen a lot and talks to a lot of people about things. So we're going to try to create a meaningful conversation, and it's going to be fun trying to decide who's hosting who. Oh, no. Because
Chuck is the expert. Let me just be perfectly clear about that. And it's great to be here on the launch of the first podcast. I know how these things go with the ambient sound. If you're having some trouble hearing in the back, feel free to come on forward for the front row because we have a couple of seats available on this side, and we will do our best to speak to the last row of the audience, but it might be a little easier for everybody if you come a little forward, and then you can come and go as much as you want for a cup of coffee. Chuck, this coffee is fantastic. Where does it come from?
Where did it come from? The favorite store?
Daily Bread?
The Daily Bread, right around the corner here from Greenscape. Oh, and I got to say, we are hosting this. We have a great host this morning at Greenscape Gardens, maybe one of the most dynamic and best garden centers, one of our top garden centers in St. Louis County. If you need something that's green or something to put that green thing in, they can help you from the very beginning to the very end.
Yes. We happen to get our organic potting soil from here this spring, and our honest to goodness, our tomatoes have never looked better.
Yeah. Charlie has the biggest tomatoes in town. Who knew, right?
Well, as a matter of fact, the seeds for my tomatoes were given to me by a barber in Clayton at John's Barbershop in about 1992. The fellow was from Ravenna, Italy, and he gave me seeds that were a Burbank hybrid. And he said, try these. And I've been using the same seeds for, well, how many years is this? More than 30 years.
Wow. Well, there you go. That's all it takes, right? And really, if you think about plants, the plants that we're given or we share are always like the best, right? And so when you find a garden center that has great plants, it becomes the cocktail conversation.
Yes.
All you talk about is, oh, I just got the world's best liatris at Greenscape Gardens, and they're blooming like crazy. So next thing you know, everybody's coming here asking Sue and Jen for liatris, and by golly, they've got them. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of the fun thing. You know, my mom was a big gardener. That's part of where my love came from gardening, was through my mother, and she loved to do little things. And I always gave her a hard time because she'd go out and she'd buy a tray of pansies in the spring, and she would call and say, oh, you got to come over and look at the pansies. And she'd put 3 in this corner of the yard and 3 in that corner of the yard and 3 over there. And I'd go, Ma, you got to put a flat over there. You got to put a flat over there. You got to put a whole flat over there, not just 3 little plants. And she would look at me and I go, Mom, those pansies are going to give their entire life for your enjoyment and for the color of your yard, right? And she goes, but I'm going to have to do that again next year. And I would say, but Mom, there's an alternative. Why don't you just do perennials? And then she would look at me and go, I don't have time for all that. Well, clearly she didn't have time for all the pansies that she needed. So little steps in our backyard. And we've talked a lot you and I have talked in the past about little steps where it's not just your backyard, but it's our community parks, our community trails, the Great Rivers Greenway Network, connecting parks through the community, through greenways, through old rail lines, using natives throughout these sites. Charlie, what's your impression of how have you seen St. Louis transform here over the last 30 years, 20 years?
Well, I will say, when I first got to town in 1988, I was doing some Ask the Gardener shows for KMOX Radio with Ken Miller and Mike Miller and Skip Kincaid and others, and I know you've done some in recent years. And we had done some research at KMOX, which indicated that the number one hobby or pastime and sport in St. Louis was gardening. And that's really why I learned immedely that this was a town where people really liked to get in the backyard. And our shows proved it. We used to have a call-in show, and we would always rate the shows afterwards, how many calls came in. And if you got a lot of calls, it was called full boards. And the gardening shows always were full. But I think things changed. I think people are going to the native landscaping in their backyards. Are you familiar with the late Denny Waldum?
Mm-hmm.
He had his entire backyard re-landscaped with native plants. He was the first person I knew who did that. And once he told me about it, it seemingly everybody I knew was talking about going with the native landscaping. And that I think is the biggest change that I have seen in this town. I think we have a long way to go, especially in the public spaces, which we might get to. But in terms of people in their front yards, backyards, sometimes getting in trouble with the homeowners associations because they're going that way. Right. You see those stories in St. Peter's and elsewhere.
Yeah, so it's really interesting when you think about, if you take a step back up and 10,000 feet and say, well, what are the plants that we have that we grow, right? So heretofore, in the last 50 years, the horticulture world has created plants that bugs don't like. Makes a lot of sense, right? If I don't have to spray for bugs, then I don't have bugs on my plants. And there's even a company that comes and sprays your yard and fogs it for mosquitoes, which they kill everything. And what we've come to realize is our interdependency on the whole insect world. And in order for the insect world to be popular and to grow and be here, we got to have native plants for them to do their thing. There's a great entomologist out of University of Delaware named Doug Tallamy. I think many of you might have read his books. He talks a lot about how do chickadees raise their young? How many caterpillars, right? Because that little bitty black-capped bird that we see at our bird feeder that we all fall in love with in the wintertime is not feeding its young in the springtime seed. It's feeding their young caterpillars. So by the time those birds reach and fletch and become adults, from chicks to adults, it might take 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to raise that clutch. So where do those caterpillars come from? Well, I can help you. They don't come from azaleas. They don't come from yews. They don't come from hollies. They come from native plants. And oaks as a genus are rock stars. They provide a meaningful home to over 500 different species of insects. So in the wintertime, when you see those birds running up and down, and in the springtime running up and down the stems of those branches, they're not up there because it's a good view. They're up there for lunch, right? They're up there for dinner. They're collecting those insects and they're taking them back. And so the whole native world, from trees to a perennial ground cover, is all about that life cycle and supporting that life cycle. You mentioned some communities are kind of confused about that. And so, as you know, and many of you know, I'm a city councilman with the city of Maryland Heights. So I'm very involved with the state municipal league and the local municipal league, and coming up with meaningful statutes, meaningful ordinances that allow people to do and respond are good things, right? A good law is a law that everybody follows. So everybody loves to call on their neighbor when their neighbor's yard is more than 18 inches tall, because we think we all deserve a golf course green next door, right? And as a good friend of mine calls lawn, drug-addicted green carpet. because of how much nitrogen and phosphorus and insecticides and fungicides. There's a whole industry that's I can't say bloomed, that has grown up over the whole need for all of these inputs. And it's not too much different than commercial agriculture. The big farm requires all of these inputs. But if we just take a step back to what we understood was happening 100 years ago, 100 years ago, we were using native plants. We weren't so worried about all of these sterile cultivars. And sterile cultivars, where did that get us? The Bradford pear was a sterile cultivar, and so was the Aristocrat pear, and so was the Cleveland Select pear. But when you put them next to one another, they create viable fruit, and now they're on our right-of-ways. So it goes trying to evolve the conversation, right? So getting municipalities to understand that natives are a thing. So I would tell you that there is a move afoot within the municipal world to try to figure out how to do native plants. How do you identify a native plant gardening? How do you make it purposeful? How do you make it identifiable? If you followed St. Louis County just recently, all of their inspectors said, we can't help. We don't know. You've created a law that's impossible for us to enforce. So who stepped forward? The Missouri Botanical Garden and Jean Ponzi and her crew, and did a big training for all the county inspectors on how to identify good stuff versus the evil invasive weeds.
And so when you drive down the highways and you see some of the brush that's overgrown, a lot of it, like on 270, you'll see a lot of Bradford pears, or you did, like near Mercy Hospital for a while. I'm not sure what the latest is there, because I don't recall what it looked like this past spring. But there is a lot of overgrowth, and I'm not sure what percentage of it is what percentage is native and which is invasive.
Right. So great thought there. The question about invasive and native is, if we were to create a plant that would outcompete everything else, we would design it as an exercise in an engineering class to green up early in the spring, have a flower that's pollinated by anything and everything that can pollinate it, has a fruit that would be drug addicted, sweet like cocaine perhaps, like the honeysuckle berry, and then those leaves hold on late until the fall, till after frost. And so when you think of those 4 items, you've created bush honeysuckle. And bush honeysuckle was one of those, well, it seemed like such a good idea at the time, right? It was introduced by the Plant Materials Center out of Ellsbury, Missouri, back in the early 70s. I can tell you for a fact, when Dr. Steermark wrote the very first Flora of Missouri and published it back in 1963, bush honeysuckle did not exist in the state of Missouri, period. It was not here. And it was after that introduction and that shrub with that pretty red berry, the Capillary pear, which Bradford is a Capillary pear, which is the sterile straight species, is a problem. We're going to see in the next 6 weeks our right-of-ways show up as this beautiful yellow and orange and red fall color. And you're going to go, oh, honey, get in the car. We're going to go for a ride and look at fall color. But if you're going down 270 or 70 or 64 or 44 and you're admiring the Capillary pear invasive trees that have established themselves on the right-of-way, I would suggest to you that you need to take your spouse, your partner, your date a little further west or a little further south to get to where the real natural color is, because the Capillary pears on our right-of-ways, you're going to see in the next 6 weeks, are everywhere.
Well, it's interesting because it seems as though MODOT in this area has let certain areas grow what you almost would describe as out of control. And if you're letting a Capillary pear grow, doesn't a bird take the seeds from that and then put it onto private property or into parkland or wherever?
That's exactly correct. So if you thought about our MODOT right-of-ways, they're becoming literal linear corridors of an invasive seed machine, right? So whether it's bush honeysuckle, Capillary pears, insert current name of plant that's taken over the world. And so they're invasive because they're not from here, and they're It's more than just being aggressive, and they outcompete the good stuff, right? They outcompete. Capillary pear and bush honeysuckle do nothing to help hold a hillside. And so when you're a MODOT right-of-way specialist, you're worried about the slope of that land that's got to be vegetated, or the option is to do riprap. And you just saw on 270 in North County, when they finished all of those improvements, they put down ton after ton, truck after truck of giant white limestone along those highways. And I would tell you the mayors in those communities are beside themselves because A, how industrial it look, and B, how crappy it is. So, right? Because it looks terrible.
No, it does. And I don't know why North County got this. And this is really something that bothers me a lot. And I don't know how people in our audience feel, Chuck, but when you drive, let's say, to Old Town Donuts or to Johnny Londoff Chevrolet, and by the way, I don't know if you know this, but he owns his own building and lot.
I'd heard that.
Yeah. So you see that the side of the highway, unlike North Carolina, unlike Arizona, unlike Florida, they have taken, and you use the term riprap. I wasn't familiar with it until I saw it and someone explained that to me. It's like they took chunks of concrete and basically divided it up, crunched it up into huge chunks, and then instead of anything green on the side, they just line up this concrete, which makes it a fertile ground for weeds or I don't know what to sprout up, maybe the Capillary pear.
Plastic bottles, apparently.
Well, plastic bottles get in it, and then you're going to break your ankle trying to retrieve that plastic bottle, and it really looks horrid at this point. A, if it's free of litter, it looks horrid because it's just a mass of concrete, riprap, or if the Capillary pears or whatever else are growing in between the riprap, it looks like it's unplanned. And I don't know why North County got this.
Well, I think it was part of the challenge for MODOT, part of the challenge for East-West Gateway, right, which is the gatekeeper of all of these federal highway funds, is they have two buckets to work with. Their first bucket is for capital improvements. So road improvements that expand the highways, right? So that bucket is that deep, right? It's a giant bucket. The O&M, or the operations and maintenance bucket, is a bucket that's only about 2 inches tall, right? So everything that MODOT goes after and the federal government funds are capital improvements. In the criteria for those capital improvements, they have to identify if there's any native or endangered species that are going to be impacted by the improvements to the right-of-way. And if they impact those endangered species, they have to mitigate that, right? They have to set property aside someplace else, or they have to change the direction of their project, depending on what it is. We've gone as far as for the Indiana bat, which is a migratory bat. Missouri hosts a huge number of these animals during the summertime, which are great for mosquitoes, by the way. That particular animal hibernates in the wintertime. So when you work for federal dollars or state dollars, you can't cut down a tree from, I think it's April 1st through the beginning of November, because that's when the bats are not hibernating, right? So if you're cutting down that live tree, you're cutting down their habitat. That's an example of when you see all the trees get cut down in a big flurry in March, it's because projects are starting and they got to get the trees down. So it's an example of how endangered species impacts our highway work. I would argue that if we required the same body to set aside that right-of-way on invasive species, have them remove all the invasive species, and set through legislation a requirement that all of those right-of-ways were native plants in the future, the natives then, and provide 3 years of stewardship for establishment, then we would create right-of-ways that you're talking about, like Alabama or Arkansas or Virginia or North Carolina or Arizona or, insert any name but here, right? And so...
But now, could you do that cost effectively? Let's say, I don't know what it would cost to remove riprap once it's been placed, but in the future, going forward, if you've got a slope next to the highway, and you want to make sure it's relatively inexpensive to maintain, but simultaneously beautiful and good for the environment, providing oxygen and a place for pollinators, etc. Could you landscape that with native plants?
Absolutely. And here's why. Here's why it makes sense. Most of us are familiar. If we leave Greenscape and we go right up on Highway 270 and go north, we pass right past West County Mall. And if you've been in St. Louis more than 3 years, you've watched that hillside slide at very different points because the ground maintenance team beneath that big parking garage mows that hillside every week because that's what their contract says. So when they mow it at 3.5 inches, those grass plants only put down their roots 3.5 inches. If we have native plants on there, native plants, as we all know, put their roots down on average 6 to 8 feet deep in the soil, and in some cases as far as 15 feet in the soil. So when they do that, they stabilize that steep bank. So if that whole hillside were natives, that hillside would almost never slide. It would never fall, right? And right-of-ways, every time we add a lane, the area outside that right-of-way or outside of that paved surface just gets steeper and steeper and steeper. And if we did natives, that would stabilize those hillsides, require only an annual mow and then a little annual stewardship. And then that way, when you're picking up trash, or you have a volunteer group or a contractor come in to pick up trash, they're only dealing with ticks and chiggers. They're not dealing with broken ankles and all of the other things that the riprap. And just to be clear, Charlie, if that were repurposed concrete, now that would be kind of a sustainable, regenerative, reuse, repurpose kind of methodology. But that's not what riprap is.
Oh, it's not.
Riprap is limestone that's been quarried out of the ground and meets a certain dimension size, a MODOT standard, to put on that bank.
Do you see that elsewhere in the country, the use of riprap? Because I generally do not.
So
And I don't see it throughout our area much, except now a little bit on 270 in West County, and as I said, throughout North County now on I-270.
Right. You see it on some bridge abutments, right in the steepest part where you can't really safely put a piece of equipment on.
Which is understandable.
Which makes sense. But again, if you look at those sites, I can think of a spot on Lindbergh that's been riprapped for 20 years, and today there's junipers and bush honeysuckle and all kinds of crap growing out of it, and it looks terrible. But it's all right away, and it's unmaintainable.
And then to maintain it, I'm suspecting, although I don't know, you tell me what's going on, that somebody is spraying it with some herbicide.
That would be correct.
And is that actually going on right now?
That's part of the new RFP that the MODOT just put out through the state bid process for the North County ban. So there's herbicide use and there's trash pickup. And next time you drive up there, you're not going to count plastic bottles by 5s or 10s. You're going to count them in pools of hundreds of plastic bottles that have gotten blown off the highway and have lodged in the riprap.
Does the herbicide drift?
Yes, it can drift. And then that would impact all of our homes.
Homes and if there are farms nearby as well.
Farms nearby.
Yeah.
Right.
Well,
but you know what? We've gone down this nasty right-of-way, and it was my fault because, clearly I have a highway right-of-way soapbox I like to get on. But let's go back to the idea of what we're doing in our backyards. And not just necessarily in our backyards, but in your front yards. We talked a little bit about plant material being, when it's low maintenance, that seems what everybody wants. But when I used to do landscape design for a garden center back in the 90s, I would tell people that good landscape design is like good taste buds. When we were all 18 years old, a bottle of Boonesberry Farm with the screw-off cap, right, was easy. But now that we're a little older and a little more refined, you don't tell your wife or your spouse or your partner, or you're not impressed when your date comes over with a bottle of Boonesberry Farm, right? It's just the screw-off cap just doesn't have the allure that it did when we were 18. Now we want a good Merlot or a nice Cab or maybe a Pinot, right? And so our tastes, as we've matured, have matured, right? And so I would argue that back in the 90s, residential landscape was red lava rock in front of a brick house with black shutters, brass coach lamps, and then we did in the red lava rock crimson pygmy barberry, because red and red always looks good together. We would do densiformis yews, gaiety euonymus, and golden vickery privet, right? Every house after house after house. And we thought that that's what our concept was of a good landscape, because, well, if Charlie did it at his house, I got to keep up with Charlie. And so you saw, especially in St. Charles County, where they've never met a subdivision they didn't like, every home being almost exactly the same, right? But when you get into communities that are older, communities like Webster and Kirkwood and Clayton, DePere, and Creve Coeur, and further north and further south, the homes that have been around for a while, they've done that and they're tired of it, right? There's nothing best than when you walk up to someone's house and the first thing out of their mouth is, "Can you help me get rid of this lava rock?" And I'm like, "Oh, let me give you a kiss." That's the best thing ever, right? Because lava rock never looks any better. One of the things that we talk a lot about in natives is we talk about how do we care for natives. We talk about maintenance versus stewardship, right? And so when we talk about maintenance, we talk about when we put in a concrete pipe or we pave a driveway. Maintenance means we shovel it in the wintertime, or we seal the cracks, or every so often we reseal that asphalt driveway. If we thought about maintenance, what we do with our cars, when the tires get bald, we put on new tires. When the oil gets old and the light goes on the dashboard, we take the oil out, we put new oil in. But if we did those same tasks with a stewardship mindset, we wouldn't take the tires off and replace them. We'd take them off and have them recapped and put back on, retreaded, right? That oil we would take and clean and filter and put back in its place. Another way to think about maintenance versus stewardship. When we were younger, our paychecks, we put in the bank and we tried to maintain a positive balance till the next check went in, right? But at the same time, when you were younger, you put a little bit aside with the hope that it was going to grow, that in the future you could tap into it for a thing called retirement, right? And so that money was, we were being good stewards of our resources, right? So stewardship is really, when you think of the plant world, is really what native landscapes are all about. Because stewardship is the idea of putting in a plant, nurturing it, and every year that it gets better. So for example, Argonne National Laboratory, this great big think tank out of the Chicago area, has done a study on solar sites, big utility scale solar sites, where they're using native plants beneath the solar panels to improve and create habitat, carbon sequestration, water infiltration, all of the key important things. So it rebuilds the soil. They've discovered in their studies that every year that those natives are in the ground, the native population improves, the insect pollinator population improves, therefore the quality of the soil improves, and the native birds that are using and qualifying, into those native areas or into those solar sites are improving the diversity of the mix. But not only that, they went ahead and measured the bean fields that were growing next to these solar sites. And soybeans are typically self-pollinated. Every farmer would tell you, "I don't need beans. My beans self-pollinate themselves." Thank you very much. The reality is, when you put a solar site with natives beneath it next to a bean field, that bean field's yield increases between 11 and 29%. 11 and 29%. That's a huge number, right? So if you were a farmer and I told you, "You don't have to do anything and we're going to increase your yield by 11%, how are you going to respond?
Positively.
You're going to shake my hand. Yeah. And if I told you 29%, you might take me to dinner, right? I mean, that's a big deal.
With a bottle of wine with a screw top.
Probably down with a screw top. So I think as we evolve in this marketplace, right? As we evolve with the success of adding natives, and I would challenge you, a lot of the cultivars that we've sold for years and years and years are native plants that have been messed with, that have been improved, right? Look at purple coneflower. Purple coneflower is a rock star. Grows with wet feet, grows in shade, grows in full sun, can grow in dry areas. In the cultivar world, there's powwow berry purple coneflower. There's Magnus coneflower. There's Cherokee sunset coneflower. There's all of these cultivars where we've taken plants that work every day for us naturally, and we've tried to improve and modify them. Right?
We just came out of a mini drought, maybe not mini, 4 or 5 weeks, and thankfully, as we record this podcast, we've, at least by my scientific measurement, which happens to be a red Solo cup in my backyard, I think we got 2 or 3 inches even overnight, at least in the near west suburbs. But would a echinacea, would it survive without much water, or do I have to water it again and again, Chuck?
Right. So I love it when, Charlie, you bring me back to what we already talked about, right? So we talked about native plants having deep roots. So what are those deep roots doing? Those 6 to 8 foot deep roots are going down into the soil, and they're there doing their job. But one of the things that they're able to do, when those native plants put their roots down, not every root lives forever. So when that root dies, there's not a truck full of minions that come out and fill in that little root hole, right? That root hole is left. So it becomes a capillary bypass into the soil for water percolation. Or it becomes a macropore in the soil, which is a void which fills up with water. Your lawn at home that you mow at 3.5 inches will take a 1/2 inch of rain. So last night, we might have gotten a 1/2 inch of rain. If you got 2 inches, that means the first 1/2 inch went into your yard, and the other 1.5 inches became MSD's issue, right? For stormwater.
Pretty much.
So in a native area, an established native prairie will handle 7 to 9 inches of rain in an hour. Our biggest rainfalls that we get in St. Louis, the maximum typically is about 3.8 inches of rain in an hour. That's our heaviest rainfall that MSD worries about. If our yards could take 7 to 9 inches of rain in an hour, wouldn't we all just be going, let it rain, bring it on, right? And that's not what we're doing, because we have all of this 1/2 inch land, right? All of this 1/2 inch capability of absorption. And so the natives really create that long-term percolation into the soil. Our golf courses are mowed at a 1/2 inch or 1.5 inches or 2 inch. If you play like I do, I'm usually in the 4 to 5 inch rough. So I appreciate the rough a little bit better, but never find my ball. That's just how it works. If you think about parks, we mow parks all the time, right? We're mowing them at 3 inches, 3.5, maybe 4 inches. So that root mass is only 3.5 to 4 inches deep in the soil. So we're not getting the infiltration that we used to get. So natives, to answer your question, that echinacea looks at 4 to 5 weeks of drought and says, look at me. I got a leg up on this coreopsis. Oh, I'm sorry. On this coleus that's growing next to me that we had to add for annual color. The coleus doesn't make it, right? So you're out there with your water pitcher.
Yeah.
Watering the coleus, because everybody's got to have good looking coleus. I mean, to keep up with the Brennans.
Well, in addition to the purple coneflower and its variants, any other recommendations?
Oh, I mean, there are some incredible resources, right? One of the best things about having a really great neighborhood garden center like this one that's right here that serves the St. Louis area is everything that's growing on her shelf over there in the native area. And Sue is just a master of natives here. Her whole native collection, we don't have enough time in our broadcast to ID and talk about all the great species that are here. There's other great resources. The Grow Native website has great information. The Wild Things, their website, has great opportunities where you can go and learn and see people that are actually doing this work and seeing it in place and being successful. So I would argue that it's not just the backyard, that we need to integrate natives in every part of our yard, right? I did a home a couple years ago in Olivet. We took all of the front yard out. She was a retired science teacher. We took all of the front lawn out, and restored it all into natives. And I got a call from the city of Olivet, and they're like, "Oh my gosh, what have you done?" I go, "Isn't it like the coolest thing ever?" And they're like, well, she lives on a cul-de-sac with 6 neighbors. I said, uh-huh. And I said, it'll be just about time, for them to start calling to want it done too. And they're like, no, you don't understand. All of those neighbors are calling and complaining because they didn't understand. Today, if you go by her front yard, it is a showcase, right? And did
the neighbors come around?
And the neighbors got it, because now you go in and you see more and more things because the gal is clever. She says, "By the way, I noticed you were admiring my golden Alexanders last spring. I had to split some. Here's some for your yard," right? And so when I bring you a plant, Charlie, you go, "Oh my gosh, I can't wait to take it home and see how well it does in my yard." Right. And so when you do that, it becomes an infection, right? It becomes an infectious trait within your neighborhood. It begins to show more and more and more. Right.
Well, that's Olivet. There's been a story in the news recently about a fella in St. Peter's. And I don't know all the particulars, but I think he's growing some form of sunflower in his front yard, much to the dismay of neighbors. And
I know the mayor of St. Peter's very well. Mayor Pagano and I are very good friends.
Okay.
And if you knew Lynn, you know he doesn't have any hair on his head because he scratches his head trying to figure out how to solve this problem, right? So this idea of meadowing or native landscapes, and so native landscapes don't have to be this potpourri of seeds that you mix together and distribute and say, "Oh, look how wonderful it is." Right? That happened in the early 1700s during what they called the Age of Kent gardening in England, and it almost destroyed the formal gardens of England because this guy believed that everything should be random. And so the whole world in England began to fall apart because their sense of order and love was being thrown out the window. If you take natives and you plant them in a meaningful way, right? Instead of planting hostas, why wouldn't you plant goat's beard? Instead of planting a stilby, why wouldn't you plant, sweet black-eyed Susans? I mean, there's lots of alternatives. So they could easily function in your front yard. They don't have to be this crazy meadow or this crazy unkempt area. The problem for this poor guy in St. Peter's is he lives in a neighborhood with green postage stamps in front of everyone's home. And he's likes being contrary, perhaps. And there's nothing more contrary than an 8-foot-tall sunflower, especially when you plant it all the way up to the edge of the public right-of-way. So municipalities are beginning to understand the idea of natives. They're beginning to understand the concept of what's called meadowing. And they're beginning to write ordinances that help define that, right? Meadowing is not what you do when your lawnmower breaks and you don't mow your grass for 12 weeks. That's been tried. That doesn't work.
Although it might have some environmental benefits, no?
It might for all the invasive species that are growing in your yard, right? But if your native planting is purposeful and it's clear and defined, one of the pieces that are being looked at and adding into ordinances are setbacks. It's got to be set back from a walkway. It's got to be set back from your driveway. It's got to be set back from the public right-of-way. So setbacks from the public right-of-way help protect sight lines when you're pulling in and out of a street or out of a driveway, right? Those setbacks are there for a reason. So if the plant material responded to that or reflected that, then it begins to take on a purposeful understanding. So in this particular guy's front yard, instead of doing the whole block, which I really admire his gumption to do that because he's really irritated a lot of people just with sunflowers. I think he's made the bumblebees and the honeybees and the finches pretty happy, but he's really turned that whole world upside down out there.
Dumb question alert. One's coming your way. Are sunflowers native?
There are several species of sunflower that are native to the state. The big fancy one that you see growing in the field of Kansas or Oklahoma, or if you're a dove hunter, you love to put them in as a cover crop, or a food crop. Those are kind of improved cultivars. Right? They aren't necessarily native to the state, but there are a lot of asters, which sunflowers are asters, that are native to the state. There's a lot of cultivars that are available. And so one of the questions is, if we were drawing the line on natives, if I were to ask you what percentage of bees go to any flower and what percentage of bees are specialists, what would you think?
Oh, that's a great question. I have no idea, but I'll give a guess. 30% go to one flower?
So 80% of our native bee species are specialists.
I'll be darned.
20% will go to any flower in a storm, right? European honeybees, notice I said the European honeybee because it's not a native bee, are generalists. They'll go to anything. Bumblebees are a great example of a native bee that will go to any kind of flower, right? And then we get into all the little bitty smaller bees, the little more esoteric species. And they're, by the way, native bees and pollinators are like really hard to identify. In the old days, they would scoop them up and kill them with chloroform so that I could identify them. Now they've gotten a little smarter, and they just put them in really, really cold glasses in a cooler, so it slows the bee's metabolism down so then they can pick it up. Because some bee species, you have to identify their mouth parts to know what species it is, right? So when you think about native pollinators and you think about using cultivars, in some cases, those cultivars don't support the native plants or don't support the native pollinators. So one of the questions that's a question that's always asked, right? Well, if you use a cultivar, it won't work. The bees won't come to it. Well, the best advice I've been given is plant them side by side and see which one works. If you plant a Magnus coneflower and a straight coneflower side by side, do the bees go to both? Well, bumblebees will go to any flower, so that's not a fair comparison. But what about the smaller bees, the little sweat bees, the little green-headed bees, the little carpenter bees, the little leafcutter bees? Do they hit the purple coneflower and the cultivar? I don't know. I haven't spent that much time and don't have a camera set up on my coneflowers to know the difference, right? So part of it is learning to understand where they are. A lot of these native pollinators have such specific life cycles that they come, they do their thing, and when they're doing their thing is because the coreopsis are flowering or because the beard's tongue is flowering. And those beard's tongue come and they flower for a couple of weeks and then they go away, right? And then they go back and let somebody else bloom. So those bee species have evolved to hit those beard's tongue right when they're flowering. And so when we get rid of all of the natives, except for 3 or 4 of them, then we're in a bad way, right?
Pretty much.
So the solution is diversity. It's just like your diet, right? The more diverse your diet, most likely, the more healthy you're going to be.
And obviously, certain yards have constraints because of size. Maybe some of our listeners are patio gardening, for example, or they garden on their decks.
Right. And there's no better reason to put natives in your patio garden than for all the reasons that we just described.
Exactly, right? So.
If you're a patio gardener that loves planters, what do you do with those planters in the wintertime? Well, you hope it snows so they look good, or you put Christmas lights on them, or you put them in the garage or the shed
under the
for the
deck,
wintertime.
wherever, right?
And then you start over next spring. So what if you only had to start over with half of those plants? In other words, what if you had, like in this example behind us, here's a pot with all natives in it, right? There's a native grass, there's a native flower, and a native tree all in one pot. What? How does that work? Well, if you're Greenscape Gardens, you sell them both, right? You sell the native pots, and then you also sell for all those folks that are still stuck on the sweet potato vine that has to go in their front pots because they spill over the edge, right? Then those are available here too.
Chuck, are we supposed to take some questions at about this time?
I think we're probably about ready to take questions. We could keep talking. And when Missy said, Charlie and Chuck, we're only going to be here for an hour, we looked at each other and said, well, we're just going to be getting warmed up. So we probably ought to do a couple of questions. So do we have any questions, any particulars based on our... Go ahead.
Hold that thought just a moment so we can bring the microphone over to you, sir.
Okay. My lawn is a classic tall fescue lawn. And talking to Sue Leahy, she's trying to get me to put native plants in my front lawn. And I'm kind of, my landscaping is 75% native. But the lawn, I was thinking of introducing clover, mini clover, and get a clover lawn in the front and possibly the back. What's your opinion of that, and how does that help insects?
And we should repeat the question here.
Right.
Chuck?
So the question is, can I integrate clover into my front lawn, because native clover into my front yard? And you mentioned that your landscape today is 75% native. And I would ask you, is your yard 75% planted, or is it 75% lawn and 25% planted?
I'd say it's 75% lawn. In the front yard, it's landscaping boxes and along the perimeter. And then I have a serviceberry tree on one side and a Merlot redbud in the front.
Sure. So here would be my perspective. When I first graduated from college, I started working at the Missouri Botanical Garden as a contractor, and I cut the grass 2.5 times a week at the Missouri Botanical Garden. It was a lot of grass to cut. And I would meet every day at lunch. We sat on the deck at the horticulture with all the horticulture guys that were working in the field, doing all of the gardens, and they all beat their chests about how great their areas looked. And I said, your area wouldn't ever look as good without a green lawn that sets it off, right? If you think about your favorite picture at home, there's a matting around it that ties into a color from that photo. There's a painting or a color in your room that brings it all together. And I would argue that if you thought about your front yard and used lawn for two purposes, one as a picture frame, and two, as an easy methodology for you to move around, right? So what I'm challenging you to do is make your front yard 75% plants and 25% lawn. And if that 25% lawn were native clovers, dude, you would be a pollinator haven. You would be a key way station, stepping stone for those pollinators that are migrating through our world.
If I did that, 25% lawn, 75%, I would stick out. And I'm kind of a business in the front, party in the back. The back, I can go 100% native.
Yeah.
But I'm just kind of resistant to it.
Well, that's okay. Charlie and I will write a note. We'll both sign it for you after the podcast is done. And then you can show your neighbors, hey, we got a note from Charlie and Chuck that says it's okay to do this.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah, but long answer to or short answer to the long question, either way, is I would certainly try to integrate those clovers. It just means you're not going to be spraying herbicide, which is a wonderful thing.
Anyone else with a question? Oh, the woman right behind you could use your microphone. Thank you. And please speak so we can all hear you.
Okay. Good morning. Thanks for being here. I have really good intentions about doing native in my yard. I guess about 4 years ago I started, but I get really excited about buying the plants and the shrubs and stuff. I just get home and then I can't figure out where's the best place to put them. So my question to you is, are there people you recommend that maybe could come out to my yard and just talk to me about what's good to put where and how to best do it?
So I would tell you can get some great advice from where you're buying those natives in the first place, right? If you're buying natives here, then you're going to get great advice when you pick up this plant and say, can I do this in full sun or I can do this in shade? There are people, Missouri Native Stewardship Services is willing to come to your house and talk to you about what's going on and how you can do it. But I would tell you, as you evolve and you get more into this, the best way to do that is to build on your success, right? If I come out to your house and say, we're all in at $100,000, you're going to look at me and you go, there's no way we can do that, right? The reality is, for you to spend $100 or $500 or $5,000 or $50,000, if it's a stepping stone into being successful, then next year you're going to do it again, or the following year you're going to do it again, and you're going to expand. Remember, every plant that we put in the ground, every plant, it doesn't matter if it's a pot this size or a tree or one of the big trees that are out here, they're going to sleep, they're going to creep, and they're going to leap, right? It's going to take 3 years for that plant to really take off. So if you just started 4 years ago, you're probably just starting to enjoy the good stuff, right? You're really starting to enjoy what's happening. So the sleep, creep, and leap is somebody way smarter than I figured that one out, but it's an easy way to remember the expectations.
I just thought it would be nice to have somebody knowledgeable to look at the different places and say, you know, what would be good here, what would be good there. I can do the planting. I just want a little bit of feedback on.
Yeah. Are we
what to do.
tick-tocking on time here?
Get to some of the questions that were people sent in. So
Okay, we had a couple of questions that were submitted, so we'll try to knock those out. A couple of them have to do with the Little Creefcore Lake nature area, which is part of the St. Louis County Parks area. And so it talks about, this question is in regard to Little Creefcore Ecological Area wetlands. Since the recent commercial development in that area, wells were added in those development plans to control the flooding. How is Maryland Heights helping to bring back water into the wetlands since the natural flooding has been harnessed? Well, I could tell you natural flooding will never truly be harnessed, but let me share some insights with you because I've been involved with the Howard Bend Levee District, the Maryland Park Lake District for about 30 years. I can tell you that area is 3,300 acres in size. 1,100 of those acres are set aside as part of the Highway 364 development as a park area. So most of that is St. Louis County Park. About 800 of those acres are inside the levee, and there's 300 acres outside the levee, but that's all part of the 1,100 acres. Of the 1,100, so that leaves us 2,200 if you're doing math at home on your fingers. So of the 3,300 acres, 2,200 acres is available for development. So part of the development plans that the city has passed requires that 35% of all the property that's developed has to be set aside as green space. So if you do the math on 2,200 acres, that puts you somewhere about 800 plus acres that has to be green space. So you're creating a district that's about 7 square miles, of which 56% of it by statute has to be green space. And I would challenge you to find another community in the country that has a 56% green space requirement. Now, having said that, we've taken that another step further. We are encouraging, like greatly encouraging from the city's staff to have all of the lighting fixtures be night sky lighting so that when birds fly over the top, they're not distracted and get brought off course, which is pretty clever. We've had that in place for 5 or 10 years. As you know, anytime in St. Louis County you disturb more than an acre, you have to do a stormwater quality basin. And what makes stormwater quality basins work over time? You're right, Charlie. Native plants, right? Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So native plants are the secret. So native plants fall into that all of the time. We're also talking about looking at, could we incentivize or could we require this 500,000 square foot or 750,000 square foot office warehouse to have solar panels on the rooftop, right? That's kind of a clever idea. Why wouldn't you do that? They're not really heavy. And if you have a 500,000 square foot warehouse that's about 10 acres of solar capacity, which creates 1 megawatt of power through the sun, which generates about $75,000 a year in revenue back to that facility. So it's kind of interesting when you look at sustainability and you look at how to be clever in Creefcore, in the Little Creefcore area and the adjoining properties. But I would tell you, Maryland Heights, we're really pushing for that. You happen to ask a question that I know a lot about because I've been involved with it for 30 years. So another question was, I've often dreamed of turning larger public spaces into native gardens. So as long as greenways, trails, railroad right-of-ways, and streets and highway medians. How could we incentivize this idea? Well, you could start with your local Parks Department. You can start with your local elected officials, and you can start looking at what does it take to do that. One thing that has happened on the state level is, we looked at calorie pears and 4 or 5 other species of plants that are becoming a problem all over the state, and they were still being sold. They weren't being sold at good quality landscape garden centers like this one, but they were being sold at the big box stores. So through hard work in the state legislature this past August, out of the 64 bills that the governor signed, one of those was the cease the sale legislation, which precludes the sale of 5-6 species of invasive plants into the state of Missouri. That was put together by Missouri Department of Conservation, Missouri Prairie Foundation, Conservation Federation of Missouri, the Missouri Municipal League. There was a lot of partners, Department of Agriculture, that came together to lobby in Jefferson City. So there's that level as well.
But you need a champion, don't you?
You got to have a champion.
Yeah.
I would tell you that it starts with a parks department. And if your park has a field like this, a slope on a big angle, let me remind you, you're never going to play soccer or pickleball on a slope. And if your expectation as a community is that slope should be mowed every week, I would tell you to go back and reevaluate what your expectation should be, because it could be a really clever, cool pollinator garden. That whole thing could be a native plant haven, and there's nothing better. We haven't really talked about it, but watch his face when I say bees and butterflies. See how he smiles? All you have to do is say bee and butterflies, and that starts the process.
Can I throw in a quick personal question? You don't mind? Okay. Because time is limited, I know. But, okay, October 11th, we're going to plant, and I know this flies in the face of the spirit of the conversation. We're going to plant daffodils on the Skinker exit of 6440. We have 6,000 of them. It's the 4th or 5th year that we're doing this. What in the future could we plant there that would be more in the spirit of native species so that it would look good in the springtime and be easy to maintain?
Right. So MODOT likes to mow it, right?
Now, I will say, this is not MODOT because they won't allow us to do this. This property on the north side of the highway is owned by the city of St. Louis and Forest Park Forever, the city of St. Louis Parks,
City of St. Louis.
Recreation and Forestry.
So there is a whole spring native mix that could be seeded over the top of your daffodils and wouldn't necessarily directly compete with the daffodils, but as those daffodils wane, those natives would come in and take off and do a great job, 18 to 24 or 30 inches in height. They don't have to be 8-foot tall ashy sunflowers in the middle of October. They could be something that looked orderly.
Would it look orderly?
It would look orderly and look purposeful.
Okay.
And that's the secret.
Overall, your opinions on daffodils, because we're getting our daffodils through Brightside St. Louis, formerly known as Operation Brightside, and they have a big campaign every year to sell daffodils to raise money for the organization. But the question then is there some substitute in the future that would be more appropriate?
Wow, that's a great question. I would really have to think that native plants, and making a potpourri of species available to people to plant for success, as opposed to relying just on a monoculture.
I hear you.
So are we timed out? We're timed out. So we're going to wrap this up. Charlie, I can't say thank you enough, buddy.
Much. Oh, this was fascinating.
It's been fantastic. Welcome. I mean, our first inaugural podcast. Our Missy Castro has told me that this is the first of 724 of these that we'll be doing. So I would say stay tuned. We're going to have a lot of fun. We're also going to stick around for a little bit. I'm certainly going to stick around if you have questions that we can carry on further. And I would be remiss to say to Jen and the great team here at Greenscape and Sue, thank you all so much for being our first host. You've set the bar. Thank you. And I'm also told that any cookies that are left, Charlie's going to have to eat for breakfast. So please knock yourself out.
So don't eat any.
Okay.
Well, Chuck, you did a great job. How about Chuck Caverly, ladies and gentlemen? Thanks for coming out. I think this is Faneuil Hall. This is the Sons and Daughters of Liberty. This is where we are going to start the revolution for native species. And historians in 50 years will say, It started at a meeting on Barrett Station Road. Especially with those highways. Linda Jelinek wrote that question about the highways, the railroad right-of-ways. Right. We do need Lady Bird Johnson or Kay Dry, Leo Dry, or somebody to really take charge. But you know, the problem with going to the Parks and Recreation Departments, there's 96 of them in the county alone. So you need, you need like one governor.
One step.
Yeah.
One step, one backyard at a time, Sheriff.
But you know what? We've got the Spanish Lake Clean and Green team and the I Love Ladue group, and everybody's working separately. We need somehow a large coalition of all these like-minded people behind Chuck Caverly 4 more years. But I will say, if anyone wants to plant daffodils on October 11th, we're looking for volunteers, and we will give you a gift certificate to, it's called Bridge Bakery. It's on Cherokee. It's great bakery products created by the formerly homeless. Ticket to the Cinema St. Louis High Point Theater, and 2 tickets to see the Cardinals in their 2026 championship season. So there's something in it for you.
Optimistic right there. That's what it's all about. Yeah. Great. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.